Hey everyone, 99% of you watching aren't subscribed. Let's change that. Hit that subscribe button, and at 1,000 subscribers, we'll drop special stories just for you.
The object entered the solar system without fanfare. No blazing comet tail. No dramatic warp signature. No hostile broadcast. It simply appeared, coasting past the orbit of Neptune like a corpse drifting into shallow water. The first to notice, it was a deep-range survey array stationed beyond Pluto's orbit. The anomaly registered as a metallic mass roughly 9 kilometers long, power output minimal, trajectory unstable. It wasn't broadcasting on any known human frequency. It wasn't maneuvering. It was drifting. Within hours, every major spacefaring nation had eyes on it. Within a day, a joint coalition task force was formed. Humanity had never encountered extraterrestrial intelligence before. No one wanted the first contact protocol to begin with a trigger-happy patrol ship. When the boarding vessel Resolute docked against alien hull, the crew expected traps. There were none. The dreadnought surface was a cathedral of scars. Impact craters melted armor plates, deep fractures that suggested combat on a scale humanity had never witnessed. Its structure was alien, yet disturbingly logical, grown metal corridors spiraling inward like the bones of something once alive. No bodies, no defense drones, no atmosphere. But deep in the ship's core, there was power. A single chamber remained active. At its center hovered a crystalline lattice the size of a skyscraper, humming softly. It radiated faint quantum emissions, structured and deliberate. A data archive. The first file auto-translated after 3 days of computational brute force. It was not a greeting. It was a record. The archive was vast, meticulously organized, indexed by species. Human linguists and AI systems worked around the clock, decoding the structure. What emerged over the next week shook Earth more violently than any asteroid impact could have. The dreadnought belonged to an empire calling itself the Sovereignty of Vesker. The vessel was not a warship in active service. It was an archive ship, a mobile vault containing evidence, visual, genetic, environmental, of planetary subjugation spanning centuries. The first fully translated entry depicted a lush world under twin suns, towering oceanic cities, bioluminescent forests, peaceful architecture integrated with the planet's ecosystem. Time-stamped footage followed. Orbital bombardment, atmospheric ignition, civilian evacuation attempts cut down by surgical precision strikes. Then, chillingly, post-extermination analysis logs. Species resistance threshold lower than projected. Cultural eradication successful within 4.2 planetary rotations. Recommend genome sampling for bioadaptation study. No emotional language. No triumph. Just efficiency. Entry after entry followed. A silicon-based species enslaved and forced to mine their own planet's core until tectonic collapse rendered it uninhabitable. An avian civilization whose young were captured alive for neurological experimentation. A water world drained of its oceans to harvest microbial energy matrices. The logs were clinical, systematic, proud. Human psychologists reviewing the files began to report secondary trauma symptoms within days. Sleep disorders, anxiety spikes, rage responses. The United Nations convened an emergency session. For the first time in modern history, geopolitical conflicts were suspended without negotiation, because this wasn't a human war. This was something older, bigger, and it was coming. The final segment of the archive unlocked after 17 days. It was a projection file, a map of the galaxy. Highlighted sectors marked in cold blue, extinct, conquered, processing. Then, at the far edge of one spiral arm, a small yellow star illuminated. So, the accompanying text required no nuance to translate. Pre-FTL biosphere confirmed. Dominant species, bipedal carbon-based omnivore. Aggression markers moderate. Technological capacity, primitive orbital. Cultural fragmentation advantageous. Earth, designated resource world. Extraction pending. Silence filled every monitoring room on Earth when the translation finalized. There was no threat, no demand, no warning, just scheduling. Humanity was not an enemy, not a rival, not even prey. It was inventory. Public disclosure could not be delayed. The data leak spread faster than governments could contain it. Within hours, the images of annihilated alien worlds flooded global networks. The initial reaction was disbelief, then fear, then something far more dangerous. Anger. The sovereignty had intended the archive as a record of dominance, a symbol of inevitability, perhaps even a psychological weapon, should another spacefaring species discover it. But they had miscalculated the species that found it. Humans did not respond to existential threat with submission. Historically, they fractured under lesser pressures, politics, religion, resources. Yet when faced with extinction, a pattern emerged throughout their violent history. They unified. Within 2 weeks, the Earth Defense Accords were signed unanimously. Military budgets became irrelevant numbers. Research restrictions dissolved overnight. The brightest scientific minds were given unrestricted access to the alien archive. If the sovereignty cataloged civilizations, humanity would study the catalog. If the sovereignty perfected extermination, humanity would perfect resistance. Deep within the Dreadnought's databanks, hidden beneath layers of conquest logs, engineers found something unexpected. Damage reports. Combat telemetry from the battle that had crippled the archive ship. The sovereignty had enemies. Powerful ones. For the first time since its discovery, hope entered the conversation. The Empire was not invincible. It could bleed. And if it could bleed, it could die. 3 months after the Dreadnought's arrival, telescopes detected something new at the edge of the heliosphere. Warp signatures. Multiple. Humanity had spent 90 days dissecting the Empire's atrocities. Now the Empire had come to begin Earth's entry in the archive. Across the globe, defense platforms powered up. Prototype weapons, untested, dangerous, improvised from stolen alien theory. Charged for the first time. In orbit above Earth, the battered alien dreadnought still drifted, silent witness to what it had unleashed. Its creators had intended it as a monument to fear. Instead, it had become a spark, and humanity was dry tinder waiting for flame. The Vesker fleet entered the Sol system in perfect formation. 7 capital vessels, 42 escorts, a lattice of support craft moving with mechanical precision. They did not broadcast threats. They did not demand surrender. History showed that most civilizations collapsed into chaos at the mere appearance of sovereignty warships. Panic would fracture planetary unity. Leaders would scramble. Infrastructure would overload. Then the harvesting would begin. But Earth did not fracture. Earth went silent. Every major broadcast network shut down simultaneously. Civilian satellites powered into defensive blackout. Military communication rerouted through hardened quantum relays reverse-engineered from the archive ship. From orbit, Sol looked quiet. From within, it was bristling. In a command chamber buried beneath the Andes, a coalition of human generals, scientists, and engineers watched the tactical display. No flags, no national insignias, just a single emblem, a blue sphere surrounded by a ring of light. Earth. Dr. Amara Kovacs stood at the center console, hands steady despite the tremor in her pulse. 3 months ago, she had been a theoretical physicist specializing in gravitational lensing. Now she oversaw Project Scythe, the gravimetric weapon derived from Vesker engine principles. It's unstable, one engineer whispered. It's war, she replied. Stability is optional. The Vesker fleet slowed near Jupiter's orbit, likely scanning for defensive capability. Their ships were vast, sleek crescents of dark alloy that bent light along their hulls. Beautiful, predatory. A transmission pulsed across all human frequencies. The translation AI processed it in real time. Planetary biosphere designated Earth. Your technological status is insufficient for resistance. Remain stationary. Extraction will be efficient. No malice. No arrogance. Just fact. In Vesker history, that statement had always been correct. The first shot was not fired by the invaders. It came from Titan. Hidden beneath methane seas, humanity had constructed its first operational gravlance platform. The weapons principle was brutally simple. compress localized spacetime into a needle-point singularity, and release it forward at relativistic velocity. A weapon never tested in live combat. The Vesker carrier-designated Prime Vessel 3 drifted slightly ahead of formation. The grav lance fired. There was no beam, no flash, just a distortion, like glass warping under pressure, followed by catastrophic implosion. The carrier folded inward, crushed into a sphere of incandescent metal before its own reactor detonated, scattering debris across thousands of kilometers. Silence filled the human command chamber. On Vesker tactical channels, something unprecedented occurred. Confusion. The remaining ships shifted formation instantly, shields flare into life in layered geometric matrices. Return fire streaked toward Titan. Plasma arcs capable of liquefying continents. Human defense satellites ignited in response, unleashing kinetic interceptors and experimental phase disruptors. Space erupted into violent light. The first battle of Sol had begun. The Vesker had expected desperation. They encountered adaptation. Human ships, small compared to sovereignty cruisers, move erratically, using unpredictable thrust vectors. They did not adhere to standard fleet symmetry. They swarmed. They feinted. They sacrificed units to gather data. Every impact was analyzed in real time. Every shield frequency recalibrated. Every casualty studied. Within hours, Earth's forces adjusted their weapon output to exploit micro-fluctuations in Vesker's shielding harmonics. What began as ineffective fire became precise punctures. A second sovereignty cruiser detonated near Mars. Then a third. For the first time in recorded Imperial history, a pre-FTL species had destroyed multiple Vesker capital ships in open engagement. On the bridge of the Sovereignty flagship, Commander Threxel experienced something no training simulation had prepared him for. Uncertainty. Assess the anomaly, he demanded. Species response exceeds projections, an officer replied. They integrate observed data at accelerating velocity. Threxel studied the battlefield display. Human ships were reconfiguring mid-conflict, physical modular sections rearranging based on new tactical algorithms. They are learning, the officer whispered. No, Threxel corrected slowly. They are evolving. The battle stretched for 18 hours. Jupiter's orbit became a graveyard of molten wreckage. Human losses were catastrophic. Entire squadrons vanished under plasma bombardment. A defense ring above Earth fractured under concentrated fire. But every Vesker victory came at cost. And cost was something the Empire was in use of paying. When the Gravlands platform prepared a second firing cycle, its core containment began to fail. Engineers screamed warnings across secure channels. Dr. Kovac did not hesitate. Fire. The second singularity tore through space and struck the Vesker flagship along its spinal axis. The ship did not implode cleanly. Instead, it sheared apart, reactor halves separating in a bloom of violent blue light. The remaining Sovereignty vessels recalculated. Probability of total victory had fallen below acceptable threshold. For the first time in centuries, the Vesker fleet transmitted a fleet-wide command rarely used. Strategic withdrawal. Warp signatures flared. Human interceptors attempted pursuit, but the surviving alien ships vanished into folded space-time. The Sol system fell quiet. Debris fields glittered in the darkness. Human ships drifted, scarred and broken. On Earth, there was no cheering, only exhausted disbelief. They had not won a war. They had survived a first encounter. In the aftermath, analysis teams reviewed combat telemetry captured from Vesker transmissions. One phrase repeated across multiple encrypted channels before retreat. Incorrect species classification. The Sovereignty had categorized humanity as resource stock. Instead, they had awakened a predator shaped by millennia of internal conflict, rapid innovation, and a biological wiring that converted fear into fury. Earth mourned its dead. Then it began building faster. Shipyards expanded into orbital rings. Lunar facilities doubled output. Mars converted its terraforming reactors into weapons manufacturing plants. Humanity had learned something critical in the Battle of Jupiter. The Vesker could be hurt, and if they could be hurt, they could be hunted. Far beyond Sol, the battered remnants of the fleet regrouped at a forward Empire outpost. reports flowed upward through the sovereignty hierarchy. For the first time in centuries, the Empire updated a strategic database entry. Species designation, human, threat classification, escalating. Recommended response, full suppression armada. They believed overwhelming force would correct their error. They did not yet understand the deeper mistake. By attacking Earth after revealing their atrocities, they had not intimidated humanity, they had unified it. And a united humanity was far more dangerous than a primitive one. The spark had ignited, and the galaxy had forgotten what fire could do. The galaxy had been quiet for a long time. Not peaceful, just quiet. After the first Vesker conquest centuries earlier, resistance had become a myth. Surviving civilizations learned the same lesson in different languages. Hide, comply, or vanish. The sovereignty's expansion was not chaotic. It was procedural, efficient, documented. And then came the anomaly from the spiral arm's forgotten edge. Human, the second Vesker armada, did not enter Sol cautiously. It arrived like judgment. 200 warships tore open space-time beyond Saturn's orbit, vast crescent hulls layered in adaptive shielding. Escort carriers deploying automated strike swarms by the thousands. At the center of the formation loomed a World Eater engine, a stellar harvesting construct capable of destabilizing planetary cores through gravitational resonance. The message transmitted toward Earth was brief. Correction is underway. But Sol was no longer the same system they had attacked months earlier. Orbital space had transformed into a lattice of defense arrays. Asteroid belts had been hollowed and converted into mass driver platforms. Swarms of autonomous drones drifted between planets like metallic pollen, linked by quantum entanglement relays derived from captured Vesker technology. Humanity had not tried to match the sovereignty ship for ship. It had changed the battlefield. The first phase of the assault began with overwhelming bombardment. Vesker plasma lances carved through outer defense platforms, vaporizing entire installations in seconds. Titan's methane seas ignited again under orbital fire. Human casualties climbed into the millions within the first hour. And still, Earth did not surrender. Instead, the void between Saturn and Jupiter began to shimmer. The Vesker fleet had mapped the system's gravity wells months ago. What they had not predicted were artificial distortions, micro-singularity mines seeded throughout the approach corridor. When triggered, they collapsed inward, tearing at shield harmonics and dragging strike craft into spiraling deaths. The battlefield became chaos. Human vessels did not hold rigid lines. They fractured into independent hunter cells, striking supply ships, targeting shield generators, then vanishing into sense-blind pockets created by gravitational interference. On the Sovereignty flagship Dominion Ascendant, High Marshal Orcs studied the unfolding disaster. These patterns are irrational, an officer hissed. They sacrifice assets without preserving formation integrity. Vorex's gaze narrowed. No, he said slowly. They are not preserving ships. A projection highlighted human strike vectors converging on the World Eater engine. They are preserving their world. Human strategy had shifted from defensive survival to surgical offense. Project Side had evolved. Grav Lancers were no longer stationary platforms. They had been miniaturized into cruiser-class spinal weapons. Risky, unstable, often fatal to the ship firing them. Volunteer crews lined up regardless. The first mobile Gravland strike shattered the World Eater's forward containment ring. The second pierced its energy spine. The third overloaded its core. When the engine detonated, the shockwave rippled across millions of kilometers, tearing apart Vesker escort formations and crippling several capital ships. For the first time in the Sovereignty's expansion history, an extermination asset had been destroyed by its intended target. Panic flickered through command channels. Across the galaxy, encrypted Vesker networks carried fragments of the battle, signals intercepted by species long forced into silence. On a dim oceanic moon light years away, the remnants of civilization once catalogued as compliant labor stock decoded the transmission. They watched human ships dive directly into enemy fire to protect evacuation corridors. They watched planetary shields reinforced not around military installations, but around population centers. They watched the species fight not for conquest, but survival. A word spread through refugee enclaves in a dozen star systems. Hope. The turning point came unexpectedly. A Vesker carrier attempting to flank Earth miscalculated the gravitational distortion fields seated near Mars. Its engines destabilized, forcing it into emergency drop from warp. Human forces surrounded it before it could self-destruct. For the first time, a Sovereignty Command vessel was captured intact. Boarding teams expected resistance to the last breath. Instead, they found confusion. The Vesker crew fought fiercely, but not suicidally. They were disciplined soldiers, not zealots. They had never been taught that defeat was possible. Among the captives was Subcommander Irixa. She had overseen subjugations across 3 sectors. Entire civilizations had fallen under her directives. Yet now she sat restrained in a reinforced interrogation chamber orbiting Earth. Her gaze moved across the human officers, studying her. "You resist beyond statistical viability," she said through translation software. "Why?" No threats, no pleading, genuine confusion. A human colonel stepped forward. "You cataloged every species you destroyed," he said evenly. "Did you ever ask why they stopped fighting?" "They reached inevitability," Irixa replied. The colonel shook his head. "They reached hopelessness." He leaned closer. "You showed us your archives. You showed us what you've done. You thought it would intimidate us." Irixa's mandibles tightened slightly. "It was meant to establish outcome certainty." "It did," the colonel said. He activated a display behind him. Footage of liberated species transmitting covert messages of alliance. Resistance cells igniting across Vesker-occupied systems. Supply depots sabotage. Slave worlds revolting. "You established that you don't stop," he continued. "Which means we can't either." For the first time, Irixa's posture shifted. A realization. The sovereignty had ruled through inevitability. Humanity had shattered inevitability. The Second Armada began to collapse from within. Rebel transmissions interfered with supply routes. Captured Vesker technology was repurposed faster than Imperial analysts believed possible. Human fleets, though smaller, coordinated with insurgent strikes light years away. The war was no longer centered on Earth. It was spreading, and everywhere the sovereignty turned, they encountered something new, defiance that did not fade. High Marshal Orcs transmitted a strategic reassessment to the Imperial core. Human psychological profile incompatible with compliance modeling. Exposure to sovereignty atrocities increases aggression output exponentially. Species demonstrates adaptive warfare at unprecedented velocity. Recommendation, total mobilization. The reply from the core world came after a long silence. Mobilization authorized. But within hidden corners of occupied space, something irreversible had already begun. For centuries, the galaxy had believed resistance was futile. Now they had proof that it was merely costly. And humans were very willing to pay. As the battered remnants of Second Armada retreated beyond Sol's Edge, Earth did not celebrate. Shipyards worked without pause. Allied signals strengthened. And far from home, human exploration fleets began moving outward, not to conquer, but to find those who had survived. The sovereignty had intended to erase humanity quietly. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous than a rival empire. They had created a symbol. And symbols, once ignited, are very hard to extinguish. The war stopped being about Earth today. The first liberated world sent ships to fight beside humanity. They arrived scarred and mismatched. Retrofit freighters turned missile barges. Ancient defense craft dragged out of planetary graveyards. Vessels built from stolen sovereignty scrap. Their hulls bore the markings of species long believed extinct. They did not come because humanity demanded tribute. They came because humanity had done the unthinkable. It had made the Vesker retreat. And that changed everything. The coalition of the uncatalogued. Within a year, the Sol system was no longer the center of resistance. It was a forge. Human engineers worked side by side with alien scientists whose civilizations had been shattered generations ago. Where the Vesker valued rigid hierarchy, the coalition thrived on distributed innovation. Ideas flowed freely. Designs were shared without restriction. Improvements happened in real time across light years through entangled communication relays. Human psychology, once considered volatile, became the coalition's greatest weapon. Where other species saw insurmountable odds, humans saw problems to solve. Where others calculated survival probabilities, humans asked a different question: what happens if we try anyway? The answer, increasingly, was victory. Operation Open Ledger. The strategic objective was not annihilation. It was exposure. Using captured data cores from the archive ship, coalition cyber warfare units infiltrated sovereignty networks. They unlocked sealed historical records and broadcast them across occupied systems. Not propaganda. Evidence. Every sterilized world. Every enslaved population. Every calculated extinction. The Vesker had maintained control by monopolizing information. Their subjects believed resistance had always failed everywhere. Now they saw proof that someone was winning. Rebellions ignited like chain reactions. Mining worlds sabotaged fuel shipments. Shipyard workers embedded microfractures into hull assemblies. Navigation beacons were altered by fractions of degrees, enough to scatter fleets across unstable corridors. The sovereignty was discovering a truth they had never modeled. Oppression scales poorly under universal awareness. The throne world. The final campaign was not rushed. Human commanders resisted calls for reckless assault. They understood something the Vesker did not. Rage would win battles, but patience won wars. The coalition advanced methodically toward the imperial core, system by system. They bypassed heavily fortified strongholds when possible, isolating them instead of sacrificing lives for symbolic victories. Supply chains were severed, communications fractured. By the time coalition fleets reached the Vesker throne system, the Empire was no longer unified. It was brittle. The throne world, Vest Prime, orbited a white star, its surface layered in megastructures built over millennia. Orbital rings shimmered with defensive arrays capable of shattering moons. Planetary shields pulsed like a second sun. High command of the sovereignty transmitted a message across all channels. Human species, state your demand. It was the first time the Empire had asked instead of declared. In the coalition flagship's command chamber, representatives of dozens of species stood beside human leadership. No single flag dominated the room. The human response was transmitted without flourish. Disarm. Release all occupied systems. Submit to tribunal review for crimes against sentient life. Silence followed. Then laughter, sharp, metallic, unbelieving, echoed across the transmission. "We are the sovereignty," the imperial voice replied. "We do not submit." The human admiral exhaled slowly. "Then we proceed." The battle that ended an era. The assault on Vest Prime did not begin with a charge. It began with subtraction. Coalition stealth frigates seeded gravimetric disruptors along the outer defense ring. When activated, they destabilized shield harmonics, forcing the Vesker to divert massive energy reserves to containment. Next came the drone swarms, millions of autonomous craft overwhelming targeting systems, not to destroy, but to distract. Then the grav lances fired. Unlike the desperate weapons of the Soul Defense, these were refined, stabilized, coordinated. Multiple singularity pulses struck the same shield vectors in synchronized waves, collapsing entire sections of planetary defense. The Vesker fleet launched in response, hundreds of warships pouring from orbital docks. And for the first time in their history, they faced not a single desperate species, but a united front. Avian strike formations executed high-velocity flanking patterns optimized for three-dimensional combat. Amphibious cruiser groups deployed fluidic plasma countermeasures immune to standard Vesker interference. Human capital ships anchored the center, gravitic artillery punching corridors through enemy lines. The battle lasted 32 hours. Entire constellations flickered under weapons discharge. At its height, a Vesker command carrier attempted to ram the coalition flagship. A human destroyer intercepted instead, triggering a controlled singularity at point-blank range. Both ships vanished. The breach they created allowed coalition forces direct approach to the throne world's central command spire. When the final shield collapsed, human marines and allied forces landed on Vest Prime surface. They expected fanatic resistance. Instead, they found exhaustion. The tribunal. High Sovereign Kaeldar was captured in the throne chamber, a towering figure clad in ceremonial armor etched with victories spanning centuries. He regarded his captors without fear. "You will fracture," he said calmly. "All empires do." A human representative stepped forward, not in military uniform, but in civilian attire. "We're not here to replace you," she replied. He tilted his head. "Then why fight at all?" She activated a projection drawn from the original archive ship, the first exterminated world humanity had witnessed. "Because someone has to stop you." The tribunal convened not on Earth, but on neutral ground orbiting a liberated system. Representatives from every affected species presented evidence. Testimonies were recorded, data verified. The sovereignty's leadership was dismantled, military command structures dissolved, warship production halted. Occupied systems granted autonomy under coalition protection. The Empire was not exterminated. It was disarmed, forced to live in the galaxy it had scarred. The wake. Years later, children on worlds once marked for extinction studied the same history lesson. The Vesker had ruled through inevitability. They fell because they believed resistance was mathematically impossible. Humanity did not conquer the galaxy. It changed its equation. In Sol's orbit, the original archive dreadnought remained preserved as a memorial. Its once terrifying database was now open to all, a reminder of what unchecked power becomes. Visitors from dozens of species passed through its corridors. They no longer saw a monument to fear. They saw the spark, and inscribed at the chamber where Earth had first been labeled "Extraction Pending," with the words that echoed across a liberated galaxy: "If you commit enough war crimes, eventually you wake the wrong species." And humanity was wide awake.